Okay, I think we'll get started. This is the fourth lecture in the lecture series of our institute towards a global history of sexual science, 1880 to 1950, the fourth public lecture. I've heard from some members of our institute so far that they've been concerned how little sex there's actually been in a discussion of sexual science, but I'm told that's going to be changed today with our talk by Mark McLelland, who is professor of gender and sexuality studies in the School of Social Science, Media and Communication at the University of Wollongong, and an Australian Research Council Future Fellow at the University of Wollongong. He received his PhD in Japanese Studies at the University of Hong Kong. He is the author of several books, Male Homosexuality in Modern Japan, Cultural Myths and Social Realities from Routledge in 2000, Queer Japan from the Pacific War to the Internet Age from Roman and Littlefield in 2005, and Love, Sex, and Democracy in Japan During the American Occupation from Palgrave Macmillan in 2012. In addition, he's edited a number of books as well as special issues of journals, has authored many book chapters, and has authored many refereed journals. I'm in here, when I say many, there are many, dozens, several dozens of articles that we're talking about. And Steve Erickson was telling me that he assigned some of McLelland's articles in his Japanese history course. And so I'm very pleased to be able to welcome Mark McLelland today.
Warm welcome, and I'd like to extend my thanks to all colleagues involved in the Leslie Humanities Centre who've arranged what is an extremely exciting set of events. I'm sorry I can't be here for the whole thing, but I very much appreciate the invitation to come and speak to you, although in the middle of a 20-hour flight my enthusiasm was waning. But when I actually got here, I really I'm very excited to be here to talk to you today, so thank you for the invitation. Okay, Takahashi Tetsu, although he's largely overlooked today, was one of Japan's most prolific post-war sex researchers, whose best-selling books, magazines, articles, opinion pieces, and journalism had a very wide impact on shaping popular notions of sexuality in the post-war period in Japan. His profile in the late 1960s, for example, is evidenced by the fact that shortly before his death, he appeared as himself in Oshima Nagisa's avant-garde 1968 movie Diary of a Shinjuku Thief. And I believe Oshima Nagisa is the guy who did In the Realm of the Senses. You might remember that rather famous movie, so dealing with sexual themes. And just to give you a little glimpse of the man himself, if this will actually work, that movie is available on YouTube. So as you can see here, I'll show you a clip in a minute. This is the sign outside Takahashi's residence, where he ran his counseling, sex counseling therapy sessions, and had a library where he ran as you see in English here, the Japanese Life Psychology Society. And here he is in a moment, counseling a couple. This section goes on for about 15 minutes in the movie, and he's basically explaining, we won't go into detail, but he's basically explaining foreplay to this couple. So I think it's nice to see. And there he is with all his collection of books behind him, still very energetic, even in his 70s. And at this point, he'd been diagnosed with cancer, and he knew he was going to die, but he was still very much engaged in sex counseling. However, despite Takahashi's, here he is in the movie. Despite Takahashi's popular profile, his promulgation of liberal Freudianism, particularly his acceptance of the ubiquity of sexual perversity, meant that his relationship with clinical psychologists and government departments was always fraught. In the 1950s, he was both detained and fined by the police for publishing material considered to have transgressed Japan's obscenity laws. but Takahashi was no pornographer. He was prosecuted for collecting and publishing case studies of people's actual sexual behaviors in his private members' journal, Seishin Report, which remains one of the most important sources of qualitative information about Japanese attitudes to sexuality during the 1950s and early 60s. Takahashi was born in 1907, toward the end of the Meiji period, a time when Japan was rapidly modernizing and a revolution was taking place across a range of fields of inquiry, not least sexology. And as a young man, Takahashi was very inspired to study psychology by this guy, politician and biologist Yamamoto Senji. Yamamoto had been an early pioneer of sex education, arguing that the study of sexuality should be a scientific and not a moral affair. Although Yamamoto did not self-consciously identify as a sexologist, he was among the first generation of Japanese thinkers to attempt to use the status of scientific inquiry to wrest control of discourse about sexuality away from the moralists who used obscenity legislation to restrict the circulation of sexual knowledge in Japan's imperialist period. As Sabine Fröstuk has pointed out, at this time, knowledge about sex was considered dangerous to produce, possess, and spread. Fröstuk notes how the authorities tended to lump sexologists in with other problem thinkers, such as communists and pacifists. Indeed, in the 1920s, Yamamoto had been pulled from the stage by the police when giving a lecture tour in the provinces for supposedly speaking too positively about issues such as masturbation and abortion. One of Yamamoto's important interventions into public debates about the need or otherwise for sex education in the early 20s in Japan was to point out that it was not possible to know what constituted normal sexuality without proper research. And this was a point which was very much taken to heart later by Takahashi. Yamamoto argued that the parameters of normal sexuality could only be ascertained through an analysis of what people actually did, and that it was as important to study the sex lives of healthy bodies as it was those diagnosed as suffering from pathologies. One of his research findings from a survey of over 5,000 men with different class backgrounds and educational levels was the almost ubiquitous occurrence of adolescent masturbation. This meant that masturbation could not be the dangerous and enervating practice so often decried in popular sex advice literature. Accordingly, he advocated a new translation for the term masturbation, which was at the time most commonly referred to as onani, which comes from the English onanism. I'm not sure whether it was Yamamoto himself who coined this new phrase of ji, which is self-consolation, but he was certainly crucial in promulgating it. And I thought I'd just point out in this slide here, because this goes back to a conversation that we were having yesterday about how sexological knowledge, or really any knowledge, is always already political. You'll see here there's a kind of resting there's an attempt to define certain problematic acts through slightly obscure vocabulary. So the E in GE appears again about 20 years later as the E in Ianfu, which is comfort women. And obviously you'll know something about the politics involved in that debate. So rejecting the idea that there was anything inherently harmful about the practice, he recommended that masturbation be talked of or talked about as a self-consolation. Obviously, this didn't go down very well with the authorities, but it is this attention to the politics in the language that Yamamoto kind of pioneered that was picked up and really exploited by Takahashi in his later career. Now, Yamamoto was actually stabbed to death by a fanatic in 1929, which just goes to show how dangerous it was in Japan at this time if you're putting forward dangerous knowledge. And Takahashi attended Yamamoto's funeral, and it was at the funeral that he decided that he wanted to follow the inspiring lead in making available sexual knowledge that Yamamoto had pioneered. So in order to understand why Takahashi was later to be so insistent on the need to bring discussion of sexuality into the public realm and to develop a non-pathologizing vocabulary for describing sexual acts and feelings, the pre-war and wartime censorship regime that equated loose morals with loose thought needs to be borne in mind. Anything that might interfere with the educated middle and upper classes' willingness to reproduce was viewed with suspicion. and sexologists, including birth control campaigners, were constantly in danger of having their knowledge branded as obscene by the authorities. Takahashi was to go on to argue that the category of obscenity was not itself an indigenous Japanese idea, but had been imported into Japan at the beginning of the Meiji period through interface with Western constitutions and Western powers. Takahashi's interest in what in Japanese is called minzokugaku, which is a kind of folklore studies, and fuzokugaku, which is a kind of customs studies, as well as the study of early modern art and literary erotica, can thus be understood as an attempt to rediscover or recreate an indigenous Japanese approach to sexuality that he felt had been obscured through the wholesale adoption of foreign perspectives. One of Takahashi's greatest contributions was to be the publication of a range of sex dictionaries that brought back into public knowledge terms for sexual acts that were current during the preceding Edo period, before Japan's modernization. However, Takahashi did not see Western science as opposed to or incompatible with indigenous Japanese sexual knowledge. Indeed, his interest in Freud and the project of psychoanalysis more generally was sparked by Morooka Tamotsu's 1913 essay in the journal Enigma that attempted a psychoanalytic reading of Prince Genji from the 11th century classic Genji Monogatari, the tale of Genji, which is Genji's a kind of Don Juan figure. However, the fact that Takahashi pursued his interest in sexuality from a Freudian perspective meant that in his research he was able to draw from a much larger range of sources than was possible for clinical psychologists. Although originally enrolled as a psychology student at Nihon University in the late 1920s, his increasing interest in Freudianism led to a falling out with his tutors. After graduating, Takahashi joined the advertising section of the Calpis Corporation, which is a rather unfortunately named drinks manufacturer in Japan, and is credited with having developed the slogan, this is good for historians, Calpis wa koi no aji. Did you know that? Yes, okay, which means Calpis is the flavor of love. It doesn't really work so well in English. But you can see his interest in erotics is even coming out in his career in advertising. However, he continued his study of psychoanalysis in the evenings. During this period, he was arrested several times for engaging in unlicensed political activities and for publishing an essay detailing the police arrest, torture, and murder of proletarian writer Takiji Kobayashi, the reporting of which was being heavily censored at the time. In 1933, he joined the Seishin Bunseki Kenkyūjō, which is the Research Institute of Psychoanalysis in Japan, and started working as a counselor. He became a prolific writer, publishing a major thesis outlining a psychoanalytic reading of Japanese poets, and in 1936, he co-authored a book offering a psychoanalytic analysis of the Abe-Sada affair, the Abe-Sada affair being the topic for the movie In the Realm of the Senses, the chick who cuts off her lover's penis and runs around Tokyo with it until she's arrested and detained, a big scandal in Japan in the 30s. He also provided an introduction to the Japanese translation of a Freudian-inspired book about female frigidity, which again saw him in trouble with the police. However, it was not until the immediate post-war period that Takahashi was able to fully explore his interest in sexual issues with the founding of a series of magazines which he edited, the two most well-known of which are Amatoria and Ningen Tankyu, which you could translate as kind of human investigation. And as you can see here, the covers are pretty out there for early 1950s Japan. You certainly wouldn't have seen anything like this prior to the occupation. A special issue on sadomasochism and on love suicides and small penises. This is a good indication of the opening up of sexual discourse, which was occasioned by the US occupation and the dismantling of the imperialist censorship system. So the lifting of the imperial censorship regime at the beginning of the occupation and the guarantee of freedom of expression, which was written into the new US-authored Japanese constitution, enabled a certain amount of opening up of sexual discourse. But for somebody like Takahashi, who was extremely liberal, this didn't end his conflict with the authorities, because paragraph 175, which is the paragraph in the criminal code dealing with obscenity, was carried over from the pre-war criminal code into the post-war criminal code with very little change. So this paragraph prohibits the public distribution, sale, or display of obscene documents, drawings, or other objects. And like with a lot of obscenity legislation, obscenity isn't actually defined, so it's whatever the powers that be say it is, really. So you could see that this is problematic. So Takahashi established himself as a media commentator on sexuality in the context of a number of controversies that swept the media in the occupation during the mid-1940s. The first concerned the need for the study of sexual technique in the context of marriage. This debate was sparked by the massively popular reissue of Van der Velde's 1926 marital sex guide, Ideal Marriage, Its Physiology and Technique. So it's great to be talking to an audience who actually will know a little bit about Van der Velde and the popularity of that sex manual in the 1930s in the Western context. It had been translated in Japanese about 1931, but it was banned. So this was a kind of reissue during the occupation. Van der Velde's guide had an enormous impact on early post-war sexual discourse. And indeed, this translation remained in print until 1982. It was very popular. The book itself was widely read. It sold 3,500 copies in just 2 weeks in one bookstore in Osaka alone. However, text and diagrams from the book were also widely excerpted and published in the press, thus extending its readership and influence. But Takahashi wasn't a great fan of Van der Velde. Takahashi publicly criticized Van der Velde for what he said, focusing too much on the debate over positions. Given Takahashi's background in psychology, which of course included Freud, as well as anthropology and ethnography, he argued that sexuality was an extremely complex cultural construct, and that sexual compatibility demanded more than the adoption of appropriate positions, which is basically what Van der Velde rolls out. So Van der Velde's recommendations that couples try a range of positions until they found an optimum one, which enhances sexual stimulation and providing for the best opportunities for pregnancy. This supported a model of marital sexuality in which reproduction was the goal. Van der Velde doesn't talk about contraception, for example. And this seemed very feudal, very popular term during the occupation, seemed a very feudal way of thinking about sex to progressive thinkers like Takahashi. So as a good Freudian, Takahashi believed that sex existed as much in the mind as the body, and he argued that Van der Velde, in reducing sex to a matter of friction, overlooked more significant cultural and psychological factors. Indeed, Takahashi's own 1953 book, which became a bestseller called Arus Amatoria, or Ars Amatoria, was subtitled in English as Coital Postures and Sexual Atmosphere, and he came up with 58 rules for developing a sexual atmosphere, some of which are quite amusing. And he was basically emphasizing the fact that you needed to establish the mood before you got into the position, which Van der Velde doesn't really say very much about. So another debate that Takahashi had with Van der Velde, this is quite funny, concerned penis size. Van der Velde in here says that the ideal size of an erect penis is between 14 and 16 centimeters. However, due to the kind of sexological surveys that were being done at the time, it was discovered that the Japanese penis was somewhat shorter at about 10 centimeters. So Takahashi felt that he had to point out that for Japanese men, 10 centimeters is good enough since Japanese vaginas are shorter too. But this anxiety about penis size, which I think you can trace back to Van der Velde, if you look at popular sexological journalism, is still being rehearsed today. I'm constantly on the lookout for this old idea being rehashed and redebated with every generation. And I think it goes back to Van der Velde because of this definition of ideal penis size. Now, despite Takahashi's various critiques, Van der Velde's book did help consolidate the new idea that sexual satisfaction of both partners was a core principle for a successful marriage. In the early post-war years, endless articles addressed both male and female readers on how to conduct a proper sex life, a tadashi seikatsu in Japanese, the key foundation of which was the satisfaction of both the male and the female partner. For instance, in a 1949 article in Fudokai, which is a magazine, Woman's World, aimed at dissatisfied wives, a medical professor, Miyata Shigeo, argued as to the question what to do about sexual dissatisfaction among married couples. And in the article, he explored a range of problems, particularly men's selfishness and egotism, arguing that it's not enough to attend only to your own satisfaction and then fall asleep and snore. So there was a lot of lecturing going on in these occupation texts about the bad sexual habits of Japanese men and their need to kind of step up. Miyata pointed out that although it was commonly supposed that it was women's place to follow a man's lead, in fact, coitus is an act that a couple does together. Now, this was a radical idea in terms of marital sexuality, at least, in the post-war period. The idea that husband and wife were co-equal in engaging in the sex act. Like van der Velde, this Dr. Miyata also took orgasm to be the key indicator of both male and female satisfaction, but argued that women were held back from experiencing the climax of the sex act, not only due to men's lack of skill, but also ideological conditioning stressing women's chaste nature. And this is something that Takahashi was also very much involved in. The women had been socialized into downplaying their sexual responsiveness, and there were psychological issues which were at play, and it wasn't simply the matter of finding, the G-spot or whatever. You actually had to work on the communication. Okay. So Takahashi was very involved in this debate. Another key debate in the late 1940s that he got engaged in concerned the new visibility of kissing. The public display of which arrived in Japan in 1946 via the screening of previously censored Hollywood movies. There had been Hollywood movies in the 20s, but the kissing scenes had been taken out. So one of the problems was Japanese actresses didn't know how to kiss, so what you're going to do, you get some American in to instruct you. This was very problematic for traditionalists in Japan. They particularly didn't like the way in which kissing and dating practices, they weren't just newly visible on the screen, but you could actually see American GIs walking around town, in the park, going shopping, getting drinks, smoking cigarettes, holding hands with their Japanese girlfriends and making out with them. And one of the problems was that there had been no public culture of dating previously, so there was no, in Bourdieu's term, there was no opportunity to develop the habitus surrounding dating. But because of this new visibility on the screen and on the streets, little kids were doing what's called pan-pan play. Pan-pan is actually a rather derogatory term for women who were, engaged sexually with occupation forces. But this whole pan-pan play kind of got out of control. And here you've got a little boy and a little girl, and they're practicing walking arm in arm. They're practicing dating. So one of the arguments I stage in my book, Love, Sex and Democracy, is that it was during the occupation that the whole habitus of dating, what to do on a date, was being learned for the first time physically in the body of Japanese people. It hadn't been there in the culture previously. So for traditionalists, the new visibility of kissing was a sign of the degradation of Japanese society and a further emblem of American colonization. For reformers, however, the kiss was an important symbol of liberation from feudal values. Hence, the stakes in the kiss debate were high. Takahashi, for instance, believed the kiss to have ramifications far beyond bedroom etiquette. He considered the public display of kissing to be an important aspect of sexual liberation and a cornerstone of democracy. The argument being that it's something that you can do equally. Men and women can kiss equally. It's not a hierarchical act, although that's obviously very problematic in the context of the kind of pan-pan and prostitution during the occupation. So he felt that kissing was the public display of kissing. He felt was a stand against pre-war feudalism and fascism. So he was really into it. In a 1946 article entitled "An Argument Concerning the Revival of Kissing in Japan's Sexual Customs History," because he didn't exactly agree that it hadn't happened before, it just hadn't happened publicly, Takahashi was eager to point to Japan's long tradition of erotic art in order to counter the suggestion that kissing was not a Japanese custom. Takahashi used illustrations from Edo-period erotic texts to show that kissing had indeed been a part of lovemaking in Japan's past. Although it was referred to at the time as tongue sucking, there wasn't a word until the early 1920s which kind of covered the whole range of activities that we talk of as kissing. But the actual act of sticking your tongue in your partner's mouth, I mean, that had been known. It is demonstrated in the art of the past. So Takahashi used these illustrations to recuperate kissing, to show it isn't this crazy American custom, it's actually part of Japan's past. And he went on to argue that the revival of kissing marked the end of gloomy feudal customs and the beginning of a real democratic system. So you can see how sex and politics are very much being used in this reformist discourse here. Okay. For many kissing commentators, the ubiquity of the practice, do I have more? Oh, this is funny here. So co-education in Japanese universities was introduced during the occupation, and because the curriculum had been quite segregated previously, you know, women would study women's things, men would study men's things, there was some speculation in the media, well, what are men and women going to study together? Well, kissing, obviously. So here's an example from a 1946 text. So you can see this is very early on in the 1 year into the occupation. The whole kissing debate has captured the imagination of the population. So there's a lot of debate over the technique of kissing, how long, so here's something from a newspaper on the technique of kissing, where do you look when you're kissing, like who puts whose tongue in first, how long do you leave your tongue in there. That I haven't quoted it here, but in my book there's a rather nice passage. One commentator got very frustrated by the rather chaste kind of kissing that was going on in Japanese movies at the time. And he said something along the lines of, kissing isn't merely a meeting of the lips, you have to stick your tongue in, swirl it round. Because he felt that the Hollywood models were really not being followed sufficiently by the Japanese actresses. Okay. So Takahashi, via his magazines, was a very important player in explaining and disseminating information about these supposedly new techniques and vocabulary for the expression of love between couples. This included his definition of petting, which was described as a fad in America, now well known in Japan, in a free booklet containing popular post-war terms. So you can see here, can you read that? The Après-guerre Sexual Colloquialisms Dictionary. So he's explaining terms like, here it is in Japanese for those of you who can read, petting, a fad in America, they're all doing it, right? And now it's well known in Japan. But this idea of premarital sexual exploration, recreational sexual exploration, had not been there in the culture, outside of the pleasure districts, outside of playing around with prostitutes. It hadn't been there in the context of courtship. So this needed to be explained. And Takahashi was one of the key interpreters of this new habitus of sexual technique. Well, okay. By the early 1950s, as Japanese society began to stabilize, and especially following the reversion of sovereignty to Japan in 1952, the libidinous excess of the occupation period that had seen overt displays of eroticism on the streets, particularly displays by American GIs and their lovers, began to come under increased bureaucratic surveillance and discipline. Research into the regulation of sexuality in the 1950s has tended to stress continuity between the wartime imperialist ideology stressing the role of sexual reproduction as an aspect of human resource management and the government-sponsored New Life movement of the early 1950s that promoted sex education aimed at rationalizing sexual reproduction in the marital family. As Sonia Yang points out, in official sex education discourse, appropriate standards of sexual behavior were not to be set randomly by individual men and women, but by the state. However, an emphasis on government policy, which I think Yang does in her book, and an emphasis on official rhetoric, tends to obscure a strong counter-narrative, which is apparent in the popular culture, of which Takahashi is very much a major player, which explicitly rejected state intervention in people's personal sex lives. So you have the two things going on simultaneously in the culture. Takahashi was an enthusiastic proponent of the early post-war theme that sex was in need of liberation from decades of repression under bureaucratic and militarist rule. Inspired by Kinsey, whose first report into the sex lives of American males had been published in 1948 and was translated into Japanese in 1950, Takahashi argued that knowledge about people's actual sexual behavior was more important than moralistic pronouncements about ideal behavior. So you can see he's carrying over that inspiration he got from Yamamoto Senji. So the Kinsey reports were a very fortuitous, serendipitous, lucky appearance for reformists like Takahashi during the occupation. Information about the first Kinsey report on the male was widely dispersed in Japan and included articles in regional as well as national newspapers. And the Kinsey report was important in providing support for similar sexological surveys of the Japanese population. As Sabine Fröstuk in her book on colonizing sexuality in Japan has pointed out, post-war sexologists set out to free Japan of the militarist suppression of sex in order to allow research and education on sexual matters. So Kinsey's influence was very strategic, very important at this time. And it continued well into the 1950s, reaching new heights after the release in 1953 of the long-anticipated volume on the human female. An example of this impact can be seen in a 1954 discussion printed in Takahashi's journal Amatoria between popular sex journalist Kabiya Kazuhiko and well-known sexologist Ota Tenrei. I don't know if there's any birth control experts here, but there's something called the Ota ring, which is a kind of uterine device which he invented and got into trouble for before the war. He ended up becoming a socialist candidate, very important sex. I could easily talk for an hour about him. So the two of them together were discussing the apparently new popularity of petting, which, as we've seen, was popularized after the release of Kinsey's first volume among post-war couples. Now, Ota disagreed with early sexologists, which include Magnus Hirschfeld. So Magnus Hirschfeld's writing about Japan in German was known by post-war sexologists and was actually criticized for misrepresentation. Ota disagreed with Hirschfeld, who had apparently claimed that such acts as kissing were unknown in Japan. Rather, Ota claimed that kissing and other activities associated with petting had been known and practiced, but they'd been done so only as a prelude to intercourse. What was supposedly new in post-war Japan was the adoption of this practice by avec, which is from the French avec, with, means a dating couple. Not used so much in Japan now, but it was still being used a little bit in Japan when I first studied the language in the 80s. Now in Japanese we talk about kaporu, but I think avec, if you were over 40 or 50 you'd know the term, but I don't think it's used much now. But the very fact that they're using the term avec goes to show that there really wasn't an indigenous term for dating couples, right? So the whole habitus of dating was very much tied up with the resurgence of this, or emergence of this term avec. And it was the avec who were exploring petting and other non-penetrative, non-reproductive sexual acts recreationally before marriage. And this was quite new and quite shocking and quite exciting. And there was a great deal of discussion about this in the press. And I talk about this at great length in my book, Love, Sex and Democracy. So Takahashi was a major player in this new field of surveying the sexual experience of the Japanese population. His key technique was to solicit, collect, and make available sexual narratives from a wide variety of people. Initially, he did this through his early post-war magazines and from the mid-1950s through a research organization that he founded. Takahashi's evidence-based research into actual behaviors was not necessarily problematic, since there were precedents from within university-based clinical psychology departments where experts gathered data on sexual behaviors, particularly of a deviant kind. What caused trouble with the authorities was Takahashi's refusal to endorse the developing narrative of what in Japanese is hentai seiyoko, or perverse sexuality. That labelled non-procreative, non-heteronormative sexual acts as problematic and in need of investigation and cure. Takahashi argued to the contrary that so-called sexual perversions were commonplace and were dispersed among the community in general, as opposed to being characteristic of deviant personality types. As a sex counselor, he did not see his role as that of a doctor, encouraging people to change their sexual behaviors, but rather as an advisor who, through discussing sexual problems with his clients, could enable them to come to some kind of acceptance and sexual adjustment. Hence, talk about sex, bringing the hidden, the secret, the shameful into public discourse, was at the heart of both his sex education and therapeutic endeavors. It was his insistence on the need to speak freely and publicly about all kinds of sex that made Takahashi a problematic figure for the establishment. Okay, I might miss a bit out. So to come back to this idea that Takahashi, while looking to people like Kinsey in the West in order to gain traction on the validity of sexual surveys, was also looking back to the past. And as I said before, he was very interested in rediscovering lost sexual vocabulary from the Edo period and bringing it back into discourse. And I think I have another. So here's another example. So we saw that the previous example of the dictionary was looking at new terms which were coming in from English and other languages like petting. And here's a dictionary which is looking back at older terms. So this dictionary included an eclectic choice of sex-related vocabulary derived from all over the place, including Asian languages as well as European languages, but also from Edo-period texts. And he was suggesting here, playing on the introduction of co-education at universities, he said that the marriage should be a co-ed climate. Your marriage should be co-ed, that both the husband and the wife simultaneously should be studying together the art of lovemaking in order to enhance the relationship and their communication. And what was interesting here is that he isn't being too prescriptive about what you should do sexually. He's quite open to all sorts of stuff like sadomasochism and the like, which people would frown upon. What he was saying is that people really need to talk about it. So, for example, when replying to a young man who was worried that his marriage might be affected by his sexual fetishism, Takahashi said, well, you'll find that most of us are some kind of fetishist anyway, and encouraged him to keep a journal of his fantasies and even offered to publish some of these entries in his magazine. So you can see how the authorities, as they're coming under increasing, surveillance and control and discipline of sexuality, the fact that, Takahashi is undermining that, saying, well, yeah, no, everyone's a bit of a fetishist. Why don't you write in and tell me some more about your fantasies and we'll disseminate them to the public. This is not something that went down very well with government authorities. So another interesting point about Takahashi is that despite his admiration for Kinsey, one of his motivations in reclaiming this lost sexual history from the Edo period was that he specifically opposed the increasingly narrow US-inspired analytic framework for understanding perverse sexuality. And he wanted to show that this was untenable in Japan because Japanese civilization had a very different mythology and a set of religious and cultural beliefs than those from the West. So you couldn't simply import Western sexological ideas into Japan. There had to be some negotiation because of the difference in culture. His use of Freudian theory thus contrasted starkly with the trend in Japanese academic psychology influenced by the US that used psychology to explain or treat a number of pathological human conditions, including abnormal sexual behaviors. Takahashi also frequently criticized Western sexology for being overly scientific and encouraged Japanese people to explore their own erotic classics, which he said you will find are full of words of beautiful sound and meaning. So Edo period erotic culture. I don't know if we're going to see. Are we going to see any examples tomorrow in the exhibition? Oh, not on the walls. Oh, you're going to take us in the back room, are you? These erotic materials actually depict a wide range of human sexual interaction, including many non-procreative practices. And Takahashi argued that the Japanese needed to look back at these early texts in order to learn about their own distinct sexual histories. But it wasn't Takahashi's popular journalism, in fact, that got him into trouble with the authorities. It was his members' magazine, Seishin report, kind of Life Mind report, which he began in 1953. The report was a periodical made up of original research and contributions by members of the study group for the Japanese, for the psychology of Japanese lifestyles, and that we saw that placard on the movie. That's his association there outside his house. Excuse me. This was founded in 1950. And its membership was largely recruited from readers of his commercial magazines. Now, this is very interesting. The early 1950s was an important period that saw a wide range of members' clubs founded for the study of sexuality. particularly non-normative sexualities, many of which produced their own members-only magazines. Some of these clubs emerged out of readers' requests to the editors of magazines like Takahashi's Amatoria to set up regular meetings for readers who wanted to take their study of perverse sexuality further. These included a range of clubs, and they tended to produce coterie magazines for members only, perhaps only a few hundred copies. And these include a number like that you can still get hold of today, and I've got quite a collection. Many of them dealt with male homosexuality, but there were others as well. They all had slightly off-kilter, obscure titles to disguise. Like there's Kinsei Shomin Bunka, which is a kind of recent times culture of the masses, but it's all about what people are doing sexually. Edo Murasaki, Edo purple, pink has a kind of erotic charge in Japan. So that was like looking at what was going on in the sexual cultures of pre-Meiji Tokyo. There was the Adonisukai, which is the Adonis Club, which is the most well-known homophile magazine, and actually predates American examples of the genre. But my favorite, I love this, I could give it a talk for an hour about this, the Engeki Kenkyukai, which translates as Theatrical Study Society, which was supposed to be about studying cross-dressing, joso, onagata, but it was basically just an excuse to get together and cross-dress. And there are these marvelous, do you know what a Roneo machine is? One of those, before the photocopier. They were Roneoed. You know, you'd handwrite on a stencil and then you'd Roneo, and they were circulated. And I found a stash of these in an obscure archive in Japan. And I was just blown away by the frolicking that was going on at these meetings. So there were a whole bunch of magazines like Seishin Report, which were in circulation. And they were largely uncensored by their editors, allowing contributors to discuss sexuality in explicit terms that would have been impossible in commercial publications. Now, what's interesting is that, to my knowledge, there's been no scholarly attempt to read across these magazines and situate them in the context of the rapidly changing understandings of the role and nature of sexuality in early post-war Japan. However, the sheer number of these endeavours does point to a new consciousness of the diversity of sexual practices and identities, and a commitment among a range of groups and individuals to render sexuality visible through bringing it into discourse. And this is a project that, if I ever get teaching relief in the future, I'm going to endeavour to develop. I'm not aware of any Japanese researchers who are actually trying to look at this genre coherently, cohesively, to try to understand what the distinctive features are, but also what it is that they have in common at this particular moment that they suddenly appear in popular culture. So because of this variety of different groups, Takahashi's by no means alone in his attempts to render the full spectrum of sexuality visible, but he was among the most prominent and successful. And it's probably his prominence and the fact that he addressed mainstream as well as niche audiences that made him a target for police investigation. That Seishin report was under surveillance by the authorities was clear from an incident in 1954, where the police questioned Takahashi but didn't press charges. But in 1956, the police actually launched an obscenity prosecution against Takahashi, the publisher and the distributor, based on another edition. And the police also investigated a number of club members, requisitioning their personal details as part of the operation. So this was quite a heavy-handed tactic by the police. Obviously, in Japan, where face is very important, you don't want the police turning up and rifling through your bookcase. But that was going on in 1956. Now, Takahashi was found guilty and fined at the conclusion of the first court case in 1963. Court cases take a very long time in Japan. He appealed the decision to the higher court, which upheld the guilty verdict in 1970, just 1 year before his death. But prior to this, both the co-accused, the publisher and the distributor had died. Takahashi had cancer, and Seishin Report had basically ceased publication in 1964 because of all the stresses of the court case. But here's my copy of it. Later on in the 80s, they were all gathered together and produced in 2 volumes. Each volume has over 500 pages, very densely very densely written text, images, photocopies, full of stuff, correspondence with Kinsey, pictures of GIs getting up to all sorts of bad behavior, pictures of diseased organs, all sorts of huge collection of material volunteered by the membership and reproduced and commented upon from a Freudian perspective by Takahashi. An astonishing resource which really hasn't been picked up or used in the Japanese sexual history scholarship as far as I'm aware. Now, what I think is interesting about this is that the bulk of the magazine was actually dedicated to what in Japanese is called taiken kiroku, which is a kind of record of actual experience. I mean, whether they're actual or not, I mean, who knows? But that was the premise, as volunteered by or collected by members. And I can't prove this, but my suspicion is that one of the things that bothered the police is that some of these experiences are very confronting, such as those detailing Japanese sexual atrocities during the Second World War. Some of these narratives in 1992 were collected by human rights academic Yamamoto Naohide and published his book Senjo de no Heishi no Sexuality, or Soldiers' Sexuality on the Battlefield. So if the police were trying to keep this stuff out of public discourse, generations on, in the midst of the comfort women debate, all this material was actually brought back into public discourse at a time when the obscenity issue mores had changed and wouldn't stick. So I can't prove this, but I'm just wondering whether it wasn't also the kind of political nature of the stuff that Takahashi was exposing that was causing consternation and concern to the police authorities. Okay, so I might skip a little bit, but so just sum up this point. Takahashi seems to have assumed that as a members-only publication, to share research findings, this Seishin report was somehow kind of outside of the obscenity regulations, but the police disagreed with that. And they also accused Takahashi of making available obscene publications by lending out or allowing visitors to his clinic to look at these Edo-period texts. So one of the silly things in Japan during the imperialist period was that sexually explicit stuff from that Westerners really liked and purchased and would exhibit in museums was all blanked over in Japan, and even reproductions or reprints of these Edo-period pictures would have stuff blanked out. But Takahashi had original volumes. You can actually go and look and see what was going on there. He really liked the woodblock prints for the tremendous detail and of depiction of sexual organs. I mean, the size of the organs was very much exaggerated. They were huge, but they were also extremely detailed in terms of their mapping of the different areas and different points. And he thought that was really good, and we needed to see more of that. Okay. So the prosecution basically argued that it was the very raw nature of the sexual histories reprinted in the magazine that rendered their publication obscene, and that the psychoanalytic commentary on the narratives by Takahashi didn't actually change the fact of their obscenity. And also interesting was that the police in their prosecution pointed out that membership of the organization was available to people in general, which they didn't like that. They noticed that although well-educated persons such as school teachers, union officials and museum curators were on the membership list, they also discovered a farmer and a tofu seller who really shouldn't be reading this kind of material. So this very patrician kind of attitude about who can and who can't have access to this. So what's interesting is that although the original police prosecution launched against Takahashi kind of makes sense in the context of the various government purity initiatives of the 1950s, by the time we get to 1970, when it gets to the Supreme Court, it seems very odd that the Supreme Court upholds the obscenity of this material. Because as we just saw in Diary of a Shinjuku Thief, by late 1960s, you've got the counterculture coming in, you've got avant-garde movie making, and you've got a very, well, not perhaps sexually free, but you've got a lot more public discussion about sexuality in a range of genres. So it's very odd that the Supreme Court should have upheld that. And here's Takahashi in the movie basically talking about stuff, which, if in the written version, was being prosecuted for obscenity. So we're coming to the end, just a short section. I'll start to sum up now. So reflecting on this second guilty verdict just months before his death from stomach cancer in 1971, Takahashi said, or wrote in an editorial, although it said that after the war sexuality has been liberated, we are still a closed country. Even if it can be said that knowledge about sexuality is overflowing, this process is not yet complete, and more knowledge needs to flood out. As long as words such as bollocks, cock, cunt, and pussy are still only able to appear in print as X's, we can't say that sex has been liberated. So, he wasn't tamed by this finding against him. And his claim that Japan was still a closed country, he uses the term sakoku here, which, of course, if you're a Japan person, refers to the political situation prior to the opening of Japan, where you couldn't, it was a closed country, you couldn't leave, you couldn't come in, very limited trade. But his using of the term sakoku is clearly rhetorical here, because in no sense was Japan closed to the importation of sexual knowledge, as you've seen in other presentations and as I've demonstrated here through the influence of Kinsey and other people. Like many reform-minded Japanese of the period, he was here gesturing toward the more advanced democratic and scientific nature of knowledge that supposedly existed in the US in order to criticize the backward, feudal, and moralistic attitudes that he believed still pertained among leaders in Japan. As noted earlier, the most powerful weapon in any early post-war sex reformers' arsenal were the Kinsey reports. The fact that a highly respected American scientist, based at a well-regarded university, had received public funding to reveal, among other things, the masturbatory practices of people's grandparents, was for Takahashi a stunning sign of democratic freedom and proof of the power that science wielded over dogma in the minds of many Americans. Campaigners for sex reform used both the American and the scientific pedigree of the Kinsey reports to open up sexual discussion and exploration in the Japanese press of the late 40s and early 50s to a degree that had not previously been possible. Yet, as we've seen, Takahashi's use of Western science was always tactical. There were many aspects of Western sexology that Takahashi and his followers distanced themselves from, particularly the highly pathologizing treatment of homosexuality characteristic of the Cold War period. Takahashi's early 1950s journal, Human Investigation, provided valuable space for recording the rapid reconfigurations of male same-sex desiring subcultures that were taking place in Tokyo at this time. As an amateur ethnologist, Takahashi also did much to recover Japan's lost tradition of sexual knowledge through his exposition of ancient and Edo-period erotic art and culture, as well as rural folk practices, in an attempt to foster culturally appropriate expressions of Japanese sexuality. Takahashi, along with other reform-minded sexologists such as Ota Tenrei, who we mentioned before, Ota, in 1957, went on to publish the first detailed sociological study of post-war male homosexuality based on interviews with same-sex desiring men themselves. And it's probably one of the first non-pathologizing discussions of male homosexuality published in any language. And it was in Japan that it happened, not in America. So it wasn't Takahashi alone. He's part of a whole group of liberal sexologists who I'm investigating in my current project. And they were interested in recovering, discovering, creating imaginings of Japanese sexuality which were not so rigidly limited as was being promulgated in the more erotophobic aspects of the American sexology tradition. For reformers like Takahashi, the post-war liberation of the body, particularly the sexual body, was intimately conjoined with the liberation of thought and was seen as a positive and welcome aspect of post-war democratization. But, as Foucault warns us, we must not think that by saying yes to sex, one says no to power. The post-war rhetoric of sexual liberation, albeit preferable in many ways to the highly eugenic paradigm characteristic of the wartime period, did not enable the liberation of a previously repressed sexuality so much as insist on the creation of a new, modern sexual sensibility. This sensibility required the implementation of a whole new regime of sexual scrutiny and management that was anything but spontaneous or free. Wartime propaganda had pitted disciplined and chaste Japanese in a fight to the death against self-indulgent and libidinous Westerners. However, the Japanese were now being told that they were behind in sexual love and encouraged to develop greater sexual stamina, as well as explore new frontiers in sexual pleasure. A new set of discourse now placed sex for pleasure at the very centre of married people's lives and refigured male-female relationships from the first date onwards in terms of the search for sexual satisfaction. Yet, these discourses structuring post-war sexuality were just as concerned with differentiating correct from incorrect sexual practices as were pre-war models. The need to be properly informed about sex, to discover just the right position that worked for you and your partner, to be able to sketch the differences between onset and duration of a male and female orgasm, discuss the pros and cons of a range of contraceptive practices, and take steps to ensure one's potency, suddenly became important responsibilities. As Sabine Frostock observes, in the post-war era, the intimacy of sexuality, perhaps always imagined, has been turned into a long list of criteria against which one can measure oneself and others. Indeed, as the volume of information about sexuality proliferated, exhortations to apply this sexual knowledge to one's own sex life became ever more insistent and invasive. One of the consequences of the boom in sexological surveys that followed in the wake of the Kinsey reports, a boom that Takahashi himself did much to foster, was an increasing and ever more detailed interrogation of Japanese people's sex lives, and a measuring of those sex lives against examples from the West. When did you first start to have sex? How many times a week do you have sex? How long does the sex act last? How much time do you devote to foreplay? How do you regulate your orgasms? What is your sexual type? Are you sexually satisfied? This new emphasis on sexual satisfaction as the foundation of the marital relationship placed undue pressure on many couples to interrogate and rate their performance against league tables published in the press that purported to outline normal patterns. So it's perhaps fitting then that 3 years before his death, Takahashi appears in the Oshima movie, Diary of a Shinjuku Thief, because the plot involves a young couple who seek advice from a number of real-life experts in pursuit of this ultimate goal, the simultaneous orgasm, suggesting that even in the more liberated sexual atmosphere of the late 1960s, this sexual satisfaction remained an elusive goal. Thank you.
Questions?
Thank you very much for your talk. I was wondering if you could go into more detail about the theory of homosexuality that's actually being championed. I mean, you explained that it is not apologizing, and that it's the first really endeavor to not apologize for homosexuality. But is it Freudian inflected, or is it? I mean, how exactly does it play out?
Well, that's a great question because it was very plural. There was a whole range of perspectives. And I'll talk about Takahashi in a minute, but Otatende, the chap that I mentioned, I don't think himself had any particular interest in male homosexuality, but because he was a socialist kind of campaigner reformer, he recognized that there was an issue and a problem here. He, through interviewing men from the developing gay bar scene, in Tokyo and also in places, collected all these narratives about the actual situation in life of male homosexuals. So in his book that he published, you have a very useful set of discourses based upon men who actually experience same-sex desire, as opposed to theories about why they experience same-sex desire by experts. So that's one particular track. Then you have the coterie magazines, the members clubs that I talked about, which are also collecting stories from men with same-sex desire and also translating stuff. It's translating stuff from Oscar Wilde, translating stuff from Edward Carpenter and the like. And there's this other discourse trying to understand what male desire might mean in a kind of international context. And then we get to Takahashi Tetsu. Now, he's a Freudian, right? So he thinks that the ultimate goal of sexual adjustment is male-female vaginal penetration, right? But he doesn't think that male homosexuality is an impediment to this. And he doesn't even think you necessarily have to give boys up. So in his counseling of men, he says, well, look, you discuss these issues with your wife, you can talk about what's going to work sexually with you, and then you can go to the gay bar at the weekend. This is the kind of advice that he's giving in magazines. It's not going down very well with the authorities. But Takahashi isn't particularly interested in male homosexuality. It's just one of a number of fetishes that he sees can be accommodated in the context of a successful marriage through increased communication. And that's why in my book, Queer Japan from the Pacific War, where I'm really looking at male-male sexual communities, Takahashi doesn't really feature, but Otatende does. But it's important to notice that Takahashi wasn't merely parroting Cold War rhetoric, which is coming from America. He's actually rejecting this idea that fetishism is something that needs to be uprooted because of his liberal Freudian background. He doesn't think that's possible or necessarily desirable if both couples communicate democratically about their fetishes.
I have a couple of questions, just sort of relating to what you just was saying. In the post-war period, I believe they banned hagakure, this famous samurai tract. And hagakure actually argues very strongly that male-male relationships are much more satisfying and better. And that was banned by authorities, by occupation authorities, largely for sort of the samurai code of ethics. It's also encoded there. And I'm wondering if Takahashi's recovery of male-male relationships and the normalcy of those in Japanese culture kind of bumped up against that. The problems with that particular text.
No, that's interesting. And of course, Mishima in the 60s went on to write a kind of commentary on hagakure. So you're absolutely right about the homoerotic themes that were there. I haven't really seen Takahashi engage with that text. As I say, he really wasn't that interested in male homosexuality. It features, but as just one, it's fairly way down the list of things that he's kind of interested in. Where you do find an engagement with texts like hagakure is in the coterie magazines. But the coterie magazines in the 50s are actually a little bit more interested in looking outside Japan than looking back into Japanese history, because of course, during the occupation, Japanese history is seen as kind of problematic. It's feudal. It's not modern. It's not liberated. So they're looking outwards. But there is some recuperation of traditional samurai ethics. But also, there's another problem. That was feudal as well, because, of course, those relationships are very status-oriented, and status orientations were no-no during the occupation immediately afterwards. Like within marriage, you're supposed to be getting the equality. So also within gay relationships, like it used to be older man, younger, but or gender-normative joso, cross-dresser. So there's some arguing about, well, what is this to men equally? In fact, the idea that this also happened in America, of course, in the 50s, the idea that two gender-normative masculine men might find each other erotically interesting was quite shocking for many people because of the hierarchization of the relationships. But this is all being discussed and debated in the coterie magazines. It's just that nobody's really introduced this material into mainstream Japanese sexological discourse. In fact, mainstream Japanese sexological discourse carries on Takahashi's heterosexist bias. They're kind of vaguely aware of homosexuality, but it's fairly way down on their list. There's not a great deal of useful material happening in Japanese discussing this period around homosexuality.
So another question has to do with his recovery of Edo-period material.
Yes.
And it seems like, for example, when he's recovering vocabulary, the seriousness of that enterprise, what happens when it bumps up against the outrageously humorous kind of language that's used in erotica? I mean, the words for masturbation in erotica are just hilarious. So how does he reconcile it?
Well, you see, when he talks about words of beautiful sound and meaning, he's actually encouraging people to go back and rediscover these texts. And as you know, they had been heavily, a lot of them were out of circulation, weren't reprinted, were reprinted in bolderized versions. He embraced that. It didn't catch on, of course. And as you probably know today, regular Japanese people aren't particularly interested in or aware of Edo-period. It'd be like us, getting all excited about what was going on during Shakespearean times. It's like, whatever. You had a vague sense that there used to be cross-dressers on the stage, but whatever. What does that mean to us? So his enterprise didn't really catch on, but he certainly made a big effort. And in fact, I think there's a final slide. I mean, those are just some of the books either by Takahashi or about Takahashi from the period, and they're still available. But as I said, the paradigm changed after the 1970s. He was dead. He's not really remembered. His Wikipedia entry in Japanese is a stump. I keep meaning to go in and actually write it for him, but it's just like Takahashi Tetsu was a sexologist. He died. He isn't really remembered these days.
The last question has to do with the whole kissing thing. And I'm wondering, in his idea of recovering kissing as a Japanese practice, looking back in erotica, early modern erotica in particular, how extensive was his study of early modern erotica? Because I'm asking because, to my knowledge, the first kissing scenes in early modern erotica are Western things. It was a specific text, Udamakura, which was 1784, and that's the first kissing scene in erotica. It's a Dutch couple kissing, and after that, we start to see Japanese couples kissing.
Well, what about the term kujisu or mouth sucking? That's an Edo-period term, isn't it?
Yeah, I know, but I'm talking about the actual depiction of it.
Oh, the actual depiction.
Yeah.
I don't know. I have copies of all these articles. I'd be very pleased to send that one to you where he talks about the revival of kissing, and you can look at
I'm just wondering
his
how thorough
sources.
he was in his investigation. That's what I'm trying to.
Well, Takahashi, these Japanese, what Japanese, he wasn't an academic, and you know what it's like in Japan. You have these kind of public intellectuals, but they're amateur, and they're a bit obsessive about things, but they're not very disciplined. He's a very difficult, and I'm even thinking of actually writing his biography, but he's a difficult person to assess academically because, as in a lot of Japanese stuff, he doesn't footnote. He makes claims. You don't know where it's coming from. And he's not alone in doing this. Japanese academics do this. They just, well, I wouldn't say they make stuff up, but they're not very careful about documenting where their sources are. So I don't know. He was certainly a very enthusiastic collector, but he was no academic.
Thanks for your talk. It was very, very interesting for me to hear the similarities with what I studied in communist Czechoslovakia in the 50s.
Yeah.
The equality between the couple, the right of the woman to sexual pleasure, the disdain for just positions. And
Really?
the Van Velde book was really like, they said it was shocking, but also like just positions. Also the psychogenic nature of female problems in achieving orgasm.
Right.
All that is there in the 50s. And except for Freudianism. So my question is actually, it's a double question, but relates to this evidence-based desire of your sexologist. How did it go with Freudianism? And the related question is, since they liked and he liked Kinsey so much, how was his reception of Masters and Johnson, given their dislike for Freudianism, but their very evidence-based approach to heterosexuality?
Right. Well, maybe I'll answer the second one first. Yeah, Masters and Johnson, when was that first published?
66.
66. I don't think Takahashi's always kind of at the end of his life, his career. By that stage, he doesn't really run with that, but that is picked up by a new generation of sexologists, and it's largely to do with Masters and Johnson's eclipse of Kinsey. The paradigm shifts. New people start talking, and Takahashi's forgotten very quickly after 1970 because there's so many new people talking. So he didn't really engage with Masters and Johnson. When it comes to the surveying thing, this is what I mean by him not being... he only ever had an undergraduate degree in psychology, right? And I don't know that he had any accreditation.
Master's was an MD.
No, Kinsey, sorry.
Oh,
Kinsey. No, not Kinsey. Who am I talking? Takahashi.
Oh.
Yeah. So Takahashi only had, his only qualification is an undergraduate degree in psychology. Although he worked as a Freudian counselor, I don't know that he had any accreditation. And also, I think his interpretation of Freud is very liberal. I mean, I know Freud, like in his letters, is a bit looser than in some of his practice, but basically, you get the impression for Takahashi, he was just, whatever people did was okay, so long as they talked about it and their partners were okay with it. You know, I can't find any limits in what Takahashi has to say, and that's one of the problems of his stuff with the authorities. So how did the Freudianism sit with the survey reports? Again, his Freudianism is very eclectic, and I think his survey methods are very eclectic. Like he invites responses. And I don't know if any people here, do you know Ken Plummer's book, Telling Sexual Stories? Do you not know that book? You need to know that book. You know, for the sexologists in the room, Ken Plummer, British sociologist, mate of mine, Telling Sexual Stories, got a big grant, I think in the 70s from the government to collect people's sexual stories. Him and a team of researchers went round and had lots of uncomfortable conversations in people's living rooms, had to make lots of quick escapes because people misunderstood the nature of what was going on. Anyway, he collected huge amount of stuff, huge amount of self-narratives, right? And then put them in a filing cabinet and kind of thought, I don't know what the empirical value of this work is. It's just stuff people have told me. I don't know whether it really happened, whether it's something they made up to please me, whether it's a fantasy. How do I work with it? And he left it for about a decade, and that book then became Telling Sexual Stories, where he talks about it's not so much the actuality of the acts and whether they really happened, so much as the discursive or rhetorical features within which they are structured. That can tell us. So he moves from an empiricist to a symbolic interactionist mode of interpretation. But Takahashi's grasp on theory or empiricism is just not there. He just wasn't trained. He wasn't an MD.
My question is basically related to obscenity. What I would like to know is how actually obscenity was defined in post-war Japan in legal terms. I mean, in the sense that, was it something which was related to what is written in the content, or was it related to the form of the language, or it was related to the content of the language, or was it related to the kind of acts that have been narrated in the language, or it was something beyond that? And related to that, the question is, was there any kind of debate in the popular sexology regarding these obscenity laws and such, and is Takahashi in a sense replying to that, or is he contributing to this debate?
Well, obscenity in the criminal code isn't defined. So in Japan, there are two main routes for prosecution. For stuff coming into the country, there's the customs. Yeah? So some random customs guy opens something, sees something, is offended by it, and reports it, and pushes that forward. Or if it's stuff which is produced in Japan, then it's the police. And the police have been very proactive, and still are today, in managing and surveying obscenity. But it's the court which kind of decides. And there have been many different cases over the years. So there was, during the occupation, there was the Lady Chatterley case. Lady Chatterley was found to be obscene. That actually happened during the occupation. And all sorts of weird things were coming in. One of the problems was that although in the popular literature, like the magazines that I showed, there were many discussions of sexual acts which were far more graphic than what you find in Lady Chatterley. The prosecution was arguing, well, these are low-level, cheap magazines read by the working classes, and you can't expect anything better from them. However, D.H. Lawrence is a famous author. He might be read by students, right? And students might get the idea that it's okay to commit adultery if your sex life is bad. So this was actually an argument which was placed forward. It was a kind of, rather than defining the obscenity, they were defining the presumed repercussions of allowing that discourse to circulate. So that's one kind of strand. But different courts make different decisions, and they change across time. So you might remember that in the realm of the senses, the Nagisa Osa movie that we were talking about, which has actual sex scenes. I mean, they're actually having sex in the movie. It's not just acted. That was made in Japan, was smuggled to France where it was produced, but couldn't be re-imported because of the obscenity rulings. So the problem with the legislation, but I think this is the problem everywhere, because you can't define obscenity, really. It's so random what's going to offend anybody that it's very easy to be used for political circumstance. And I think it's just peculiar that that Takahashi should have had that original guilty verdict from 1957, from 1963, reaffirmed, was it in 1970, when the whole scope of popular culture had changed, and yet the court was still looking back to what the earlier court had said. I can't really give you a rational explanation for it because it's not rational. You have to look at each case individually, really.
Sorry, please. Sabine proposes that sexological discourse has just disappeared in the late 20s and transformed in a more racial discourse.
Who says this?
Sabine Frühstück.
Okay.
And I have been really surprised that in 1945 there is a direct continuation of the discourses of the 20s. And I would like to ask what just happened in the fascist time, in the 30s and 40s. And just as
yes.
For a comparison, in Germany, after 1945, it would have been impossible to publish such genres you are showing to us.
I know. I don't think you could have done it in England,
more
actually.
restrictive at that time. And where there are some perception of the Japanese discourses from Germany after 1945?
Sorry, that last point.
Oh, sorry. Where there are some perceptions of the Japanese sexological discourse from Germany, means in Germany there appears with Hans Giese and Bürger Prince and something like that.
Oh.
A new sexology after 1945.
No. So I can answer that prior to the occupation, Japanese sexologists, sex reformers are very much looking towards Europe, particularly Germany, and France, because everybody knows French people know the most about the. It's true. On every panel, they love to have round tables in Japan, and then they record the discussion and print it in a newspaper. In every round panel about sex, you'd have a medical doctor, a gynecologist, you'd have a Freudian like Takahashi, and you'd have a professor of French literature. The professor of French literature was obligatory, and which is why I say, I speak very warmly of this period in Japan because of the broad eclecticism of the debate around sexuality. It was very very wide range of views, which you didn't get in America. So after the war, they're very much looking towards the US, and they've kind of forgotten about Germany, and they're not really very interested in anything that's happening on. Now, Sabine's a great friend of mine, so I'm not going to say anything here, but to point out that there is a debate between Sabine Frühstück, who wrote the book Colonizing Sex in Japan, and Mark Driscoll, who wrote a book called Absolutely Erotic, Absolutely Grotesque. And Mark takes issue with Sabine, saying that Sabine is she's reading the corpus too narrowly, and she's stressing the surveillance and discipline too much. Mark Driscoll says that there's a parallel discourse going on of liberal sexologists who are actually disagreeing with the more kind of mainstream pathologizers. And this discourse carries on until 1936. And it's not until 1936 that it drops out of culture, and that's largely to do with, in the late 30s, the paper supply comes under control of the government, so the government gets to decide who prints what. And also the publishing companies from many large and small publishing companies are all amalgamated into just a few as part of this information control. So this discourse, although it's fading, does continue well into the 30s. So we're really only looking at like a decade. And it all bursts back into flame, absolutely into flame within 6 months of the occupation. And they're reprinting a lot of stuff, which is still sitting around in people's libraries and the like. And some of the people who were writing in the 1930s continue to write. In fact, Takahashi was writing in the 1930s, and he continues to write. So it's at the back. I'll just do this. You've been pointing.
Well, I've really liked your lecture, and I really like this idea of tactical use of Western science,
yes,
and your analysis of how I can't pronounce his name, Takahashi, develops like an independent understanding of sexuality. But at the same time, I'm shocked by how, to some extent, what he's doing, and I completely buy your idea that this is independent from Western sexual science. But what he's doing is very, very similar to what Foucault criticizes when he comes up with his concept of repressive hypothesis. I mean, he's building this idea of a sexual past that would have been repressive, and
yes,
then towards the future we have liberation. I mean, you refer to it as a discourse of sexual liberation. And I'm really shocked at how throughout the world we find very similar parallels, even when people are not just imitating one another. I mean, you were mentioning how this is happening in the communist world too.
Yeah.
And I see in the post-war era, 40s and 50s, I see in Argentina similar emerging discourse of. So I wonder if you could explain a little bit in the case of Japan, what are the conditions, or exploring the work of this sexologist, what are the conditions under which this approach, this idea of this narrative of repressive hypothesis emerges? Why is it that he develops this kind of understanding at this specific time? If there's something related to Japanese history, or how would you explain the emergence of such an approach?
Well, really, you have to look at the occupation, and that's what I try to do in the book, Love, Sex and Democracy during the American occupation. It is a kind of reappraisal of the impact of the Americans. What I'm arguing is the Americans themselves didn't really need to do anything. All they needed to do was to push the previous regime to one side and enable a discourse of liberation. Right? So it wasn't just liberation in the sex. In fact, liberation in the sexual realm isn't really something that the Americans thought they were doing or really wanted to do. There was a widespread democratization of Japan that was going on at the time. That's why I call it Love, Sex and Democracy. In the Japanese mind, sex gets pulled into this wider democratizing process. And the use of the term kaiho, or liberation, or freedom, in Japanese is slapped onto absolutely everything. And there's this rejection of anything that happened before as being feudal. So rhetorically, it was extremely useful as a strategy for reformists to challenge the Japanese bureaucracy. If they're saying, well, you need to stop doing that or start doing this, they're going, oh my God, you're so unreformed and feudal and repressive, and just shut up. They're able to actually use that. So I think to a large extent, Takahashi didn't invent this repressive hypothesis. He wasn't the only player in pushing forward sexual liberation and say kaiho. It's actually the term sexual liberation. I talk about this in the book, saying that sexual liberation was on everyone's lips in 1946, right? Whereas we don't get the idea of sexual liberation as part of mass culture really until the 60s in a Western context. So sexual liberation was part of a whole set of discourses which were positioning the past as bad, repressive, feudal, and something to be overcome. Did Takahashi actually think this? I think probably so, because as I said, he wasn't an academic, and also Takahashi wouldn't have been the only person at that period to look back to previous periods, even in Western history, pre-Victorian or the like. As we know from Foucault's repressive hypothesis, this was a very popular idea. So I think to understand it, you just have to see it as just one aspect of this broader public debate around bad past, good present.
You used the phrase, I'm not sure whether you the phrase or Takahashi's phrase, talking about, he was looking for culturally appropriate expressions of sexuality. And I was wondering if you could just talk a little more about the phrase culturally appropriate in the way he thought of that. And the reason I'm asking about this, when you, in the picture you present of his work, it seems that there's a little tension. On the one hand, he's looking abroad, he's seeing sort of what he thinks as liberatory practices that he wants to bring into Japan. But at the same time, there seems to be this almost, I don't have a better word for it, let's say kind of hyper-nationalism, that he's eliding the immediate past and jumping back to Edo to find sort of expressions, if you will, that he thinks of as culturally appropriate. So, first of all, did he ever bother thinking about whether or not he was being a kind of nationalist or reinscribing a kind of nationalism on sexuality? And again, to the first question, what then, if that's not the case, then what did he mean by culturally appropriate? I mean, did he have a really sense of that, a sort of firm, specific sense of what that meant?
I think he had a strong sense that, as you say, he does kind of tend to forget everything that happened from Meiji. So the immediate would have been when he died, what, 100 years? Yeah. It's like, it's bad, right? That's repressed. And that's largely to do with the unthinking appropriation of Western paradigms in an attempt to be more civilized, enlightened, all that kind of stuff. So he's critiquing that dialogue. What he likes about the past, and what's interesting here, is he's not just doing this highbrow looking at the shunga and the saikaku and the literary texts and the like. He's also exploring the minzokugaku, and there had been, so there wasn't a lot of weird shenanigans going on in villages in Japan in 1970, probably, but there were records by ethnologists writing in the 20s and 30s who are acknowledging village sexual practices which are on the change. And you might know that book is it by Emma Wiswell, who talks about village Japan? Do you know that book? Her husband was an anthropologist, and so while he was off doing things, she was hanging out with the women and the like, and she got a lot of sexual histories and sexual stories from them. She's saying that in the 30s, what's interesting is that the mothers remember a time of promiscuity in the past, and their children are really conservative and judgmental because they are the first generation to come up through the school system where the purity education has kind of grabbed their minds. But the parents remember frolicking around, at the local festival and getting drunk, and the yobai, the night crawling, and all that kind of stuff. So for those of you who read English, Emma Wiswell has a little bit of talk about that. But there were Japanese ethnologists working at the time. So Takahashi was aware of the fact that sexuality hadn't been something that was necessarily confined to marriage. And one of the problems was what's the word that clears it? That's hatsuyoru. So the first night, the hatsuyoru taiken or keiken, the first night experience of sex, that happens on the marriage night, is often, Takahashi is saying, is extremely traumatic for women because they haven't had any experience or explanation, really, of what's going on before. Plus, they've got this idea that they should be pure and all that kind of stuff. And so he's saying that, well, traditionally, this wasn't the case. It might have been the case with the samurai, in but, the villagers, they were just running around in the field. So in that sense, he's trying to show that, well, if it was good enough for our ancestors, it's good enough for us. Plus, he gets into Shinto, and that's why he did these readings of the Kojiki and the Nihon Shoki, these two 8th century classical texts, and that's what got him in trouble with the right-wingers. So he had those sound trucks outside because he was saying, well, just look at what was going on. Those stories. The Japanese gods and goddesses, they're all exposing themselves and defecating and throwing shit around, and it's all very polymorphously perverse. So he did a Freudian reading of this. He said, well, look, this is what we've got. We haven't got Jehovah, we haven't got Jesus, we've got Amaterasu and Susanoo, and so. the preceding 100 years post-Meiji is like really, really bad and repressive. And then he sees, yeah, but before that, that was liberated. But as we've seen, I mean, post-Foucault, we can't use these terms. I mean, there's no liberated sexuality, right? But nobody would have really thought of those terms prior to that analysis, maybe.
Does his search for culturally authentic models should it be understood in context of a kind of state criticism of him, or of drawing upon Western knowledge? Is that a critique that's made of him, that here's this guy who's looking to all these Western sexologists and American models, and really is out of touch with the real Japanese culture? Is that kind of argument being made?
Other sexologists, particularly those who are more closely aligned with government departments, because of course sexology is a mode of discipline which is often harnessed by governments around ideas of sexual hygiene and the like. And so Takahashi's outside of that circuit of people. And Takahashi's reclamation of the past, it didn't really catch on. I mean, he published heaps about it. One of those books is can you see it? Is there Nihon no Shinwa or something there? He's publishing this and talking about this, but nobody's really interested. I mean, Japanese people aren't actually that excited about the Nihon Shoki and all that stuff. You know, we go to Japan and we're all like really into Shinto, and they're like, yeah, well, you know, I kind of went last year to the temple, whatever. You know, it's not really engaging. But the fact that he's really kind of forgotten about now, and there isn't much of a tradition of sexual history writing in Japan. I mean, there's a few scholars working on it, but it's not huge like it is in Anglophone discourse.
But is he being criticized for being too Western?
Oh, for being too Western?
And because he's using all these sexologists. Is that something that could be motivating him to look for culturally?
No, because he's the other sexologists are far more Western because and this is where I disagree with people like Sonia Yang, who wrote a book called Love in Modern Japan, because she only follows the official discourse. She says, well, look at all these pamphlets and books and white papers published by the government and the sexologists who were like advising them. And I'm kind of going, yeah, but who was reading them? Yes, sure, they say all that stuff. Who was reading them? You know, this stuff is much more in the public domain and much more kind of influential. So you have this kind of battle between these two. The people who are looking to the West are actually more mainstream. And so I think Takahashi's tactical recovery of the past is a way of him trying to, because this is the Cold War that's going on. He's trying to say, well, loosen up, people. Look what the villagers were doing. But he's not entirely successful in that. There's a sea of hands. I don't know. Is there somebody who hasn't asked a question? Who? Yes.
I was going to say, I just want to comment on the whole democratizing process and the creation of modern love. It seems to me that this is very much opposed to the thesis of Chang that we've all been reading, that the epistemic change represented by sexual science was in fact indicated by change from anatomical to psychological theories, which I think is nonsense. But in any case, it appears here as though both in the communist case and in the case of Japan, that we're talking about really a long-term process of political liberalism and egalitarianism that informed, at least in the European case, people like Ulrichs and Hiller, who were jurists, but they also spoke of the right to love. And you also see this in particularly radical feminists of the Findet-Zecke era who talked about the erotic rights of women. And this in the context of some sexual scientists like a man named Hama, who was noting that while women were trained in erotic imagery about marriage, in fact, the wedding night was often a situation of rape. Nordau, the great reactionary thinker who had a book called Degeneration, a very famous book, poo-pooed this whole idea of erotic rights in a drama called The Right to Love. And of course, this was also present in European culture in the 1880s with the huge sweeping through of Ibsenism throughout Europe with questions posed by naturalism. But all I'm thinking is here is, I guess I'm saying that in order to elicit some response about the connection of modern love to feminism and the democratizing process as something different than what Chang is proposing.
Didn't Michiko Suzuki address that a little bit? Wasn't she talking about early feminism in Japan and the Seito magazine, the Blue Stocking magazine, where you actually have a range of views about eroticism in marriage, but then it all goes wonky because Hiratsuka Raicho then becomes a little bit right-wing, and she gets like really into motherhood and things because feminism was kind of co-opted by the state in Japan. Women were kind of saying that yes, women are distinct and important, but what's distinct and important about us is our procreative ability, and that needs to be protected, blah, blah, blah. So in the early post-war period, those kind of feminists are a little bit discredited. I mean, Hiratsuka Raicho carries on writing into the 70s, I think, but she's a little bit tainted by her complicity in the war effort. As for other feminist voices, Takahashi isn't really feminist. I mean, he's aware of the fact that couples need to communicate. He's aware that women have equal rights and responsibilities and respect, but he's also advising husbands to cheat on their wives, and just talk about it afterwards, you know, which is problematic. But what he does do in his magazines is he makes available space for women's voices to appear, and there are some medically trained women doctors and gynecologists who begin to publish, there's I forget her name, but someone who crops up quite often talking about the clitoris and the role of the clitoris is actually a gynecologist, a woman gynecologist, and he gives her space to develop her arguments about female masturbation. You know, so she's saying, well, look, if your husband can't do it for you, here's how to do it yourself, and that's fairly astonishing in 1946. Would you call that feminist? I'm not sure. Feminism in Japan is complicated. It doesn't really hit the mainstream popular culture until the 70s. Although, as you saw in Michiko Suzuki's talk, there are pockets throughout the late 19th, early 20th century.
Maybe two more questions for Steve.
This lady at the back said it, and then.
Thanks for the talk. It was really, really interesting. And again, there are very interesting parallels between what's going on in Japan and this person that I studied in India till about 57. I was wondering, my question is about Takahashi and the fact that he's reading a lot of these Western scholars, or kind of selectively reading them. Is there any reciprocity at all in the West? Do you notice anybody talking about him, citing him, in conversation with him? I mean, it's occupation, so there's some contact with Japan, but is it reciprocal, or is it just unidirectional?
Right. Well, in the early post-war period, there are many international conventions where sexual hygiene, reproductive health and stuff like this are being debated in international forums. Japan has some representatives who are sent abroad, but they're people from the mainstream government organizations, and they're basically talking the party line. Takahashi was in conversation with the Kinsey Institute, but it was more just an exchange of books. So I need to go to the Kinsey archives to see. I don't think Takahashi's English was great to see, but he prints some of the replies that he got from the Kinsey Institute in the Seishin report. I'd like to see what he's actually saying to them in the letters that are kept there. I think basically was he'd write a new book, he'd send it there, and they'd write a letter back with a publication there saying, thanks very much, here's one in exchange. I don't think it was an actual fruitful exchange of ideas. And this is something that I've put in my scholarship. And if you ever have a chance or have a look at my book, Queer Japan from the Pacific War to the Internet Age. But this idea that the US pioneered gay sensibility or homosexual rights, or it just doesn't make any sense. The first book with the term gay to be printed in the title is in Japanese in 1956, right? It's way before anything happens. But nobody in America knows this. And nobody's really translating this stuff into English, and it's not being picked up in Anglophone discourse. So, we're happy to look at Japan as a specific exotic case out there. Oh, isn't it interesting that Japanese people had these ideas too? But none of that material ever feeds back into our discourse. We never learn from Japan. We only take the knowledge we already have. Well, I'm generalizing here, but there's a tendency to take the knowledge that we already think we have and apply it to Japan, and that's to be regretted. But that's the nature of Anglophone scholarship.
Last question. So your title says the impact of popular sexology.
Yes.
In the early post-war Japan. How extensive was that impact? Is there a way to gauge how widespread?
Yeah, I wish I'd taken that out. Actually, I don't really know. Yeah, how do you gauge impact? I mean, there's a lot of stuff was there. How do you gauge impact? The same. Well, I'm really looking at kind of popular sexological journalism, really, because I say you can't really count Takahashi as an academic. But the same obsessions are repeated every generation in a slightly different framework in similar popular outcomes. So this idea that Japanese people are below the world average in terms of sexual frequency keeps coming up. Anxieties that Japanese penises are too small keeps coming up. And anxieties that Japanese people don't know how to kiss. And this is one of the problems that Japanese men have with having foreign girlfriends, apparently, that their penises are too small and they don't know how to kiss. And this, I'm not making this up, this is an anxiety which is repeated across this genre of popular sex journalism. So the issues that Takahashi has raised have stayed in the public domain, but they haven't been really resolved. And anybody who is a Japan expert here, I think, would be quite surprised at this emphasis which is being placed upon sexual satisfaction within marriage, because there's a whole literature arguing the opposite point, saying that Japan's really Confucian, it's all about borrowed wombs, and it's just about babies, and once you've had a baby, you're not a wife, you're a mother. So that discourse is going on in parallel. So did Takahashi and this discourse have a radical democratizing effect on Japanese marital relationships? Well, Japanese feminists would say no, it had no impact. It's a very difficult question to answer.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.